Hi, and welcome to Gettysburg. I'm so excited to have a talk with both of you over here. Before starting, let's give a brief introduction of ourselves. I would like to start with mine. I am Samriddhi Guragai, a student at Gettysburg College, originally from Nepal. That's it. Moving on to Tracy.
There's a whole lot more to Samriddhi than that, but we're going to pull it out in this conversation. I'm Tracy Potts. I'm the executive director of the Eisenhower Institute, and we sponsor the podcast. And I've also been working with a campus program called Conversations for Change that I'm really excited about.
Nice. Yeah, great to meet you both. Great to be on with Arno. I'm Pardeep Kaleka. I am a co-founder of Serve to Unite. My background is in mental health and preventing targeted violence. I've worked with Arno for the past 13 years now, since 2012, where a tragedy that happened in Oak Creek at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin fatefully brought both of us together to do the work that we do. And we're just excited to have this conversation with you all today.
My name's Arno Michaelis. It's always hard for me to say what I do. There's never a simple answer. I guess the simple answer is I'm a storyteller. I tell stories mainly in the form of speaking. I'm part of Serve to Unite with Pardeep. I've been involved in publishing 2 books. I've also done a bit of filmmaking, which I love to do. And I'm also a peer exit specialist at Parents for Peace, where we coach families who have a radicalized loved one how to create an environment most conducive to leading them to a better place. All the work I do today is informed by my past as a white nationalist from 1987 to 1994.
Wow. So much to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I know, right?
Yeah. But she's the person with a question.
All right.
So August 5th, 2012, it's a significant day. I just want to know that, do you mind sharing your experience on that day? What happened to the people who does not know about this, and what was going through your mind all the time?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. What happened in 2012, and I think that what we have to do is kind of paint the picture of what was going on at that time, even in our country. This was former President Obama's re-election summer. And in Oak Creek, Wisconsin is kind of like any town in America where the demographic was shifting over, and there's a lot of anxiety kind of around that, and around politics at the time. And that's when August 5th, 2012 happened. And for us, Arno and I both talk about our lives before that and then kind of after that. And for me, as a Sikh American, I came to this country when I was 6 years old. My parents moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin from Punjab, India. And growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you grew up with the understanding of just kind of who you are, what your existence feels like to you yourself. And I think all of us are experts on the way our existence feels like to us. And you're growing up on the south side of Milwaukee, you really start to develop a sense of yourself and your personhood. And when 2012 happened, I was already kind of dedicated to being a police officer, being an educator. I was sort of wired in the way that I wanted to give of myself and be of service. And I guess I just didn't know what that was going to look like until, as you said, that fateful day kind of brought us together, and really asked us the question of, what are you all going to, not just us personally, but all of us, what are you going to do, and how are you going to address the hate that may have been here for a very long time going forward?
The same question goes to you, Arno, as well. What was going through your mind when this incident happened?
So prior to beginning my current career, as however you describe it, I was an information technology consultant. And in 2012, I was in a transition period where I was going from IT to being speaker, author, filmmaker, storyteller guy that I am now. And on Sunday, August 5th, 2012, I was doing IT work for a client who was in Gurnee, Illinois, about 45 minutes south of Oak Creek. And I worked on weekends whenever I could because the end users aren't in my way and I'm not in their way. And I'm doing some maintenance work on servers, and I'm sure I'm the only IT guy to ever do this, but as the servers are rebooting and the progress bars for backups and updates are going, I'm dipping into my social media. Back then there was a thing,
you're the only employee ever.
I'm sure
who's
that's
done social
completely
media work
unique
ever.
to me. Back then there was a thing called Twitter, and I used to use Twitter. And I recall my Twitter feed just blowing up, Sikh temple shooting, multiple gunmen, not sure how many fatalities. And this is all like scrolling down my screen. Like I can always picture that scroll of all these people reacting to it and people chiming in like they know what's happening and other people are trying to find out what's happening. And I just had a sinking feeling as I saw this unfolding digitally that white nationalism had something to do with it. It wasn't until later that day, actually later that evening, that it was revealed on media coverage that the shooter was an affiliated white nationalist. They didn't say his name at the time. And when I was a white nationalist from 1987 to 1994, I was active in that area, in Milwaukee, the surrounding area, Oak Creek, Racine, Kenosha, other smaller Rust Belt cities between Milwaukee and Chicago. And I lay awake that night wondering if it was someone I had perhaps recruited who had committed this heinous crime. And of course, by the end of the evening, the number of fatalities is starting to come out. They said 6 people had been killed. An officer was very badly wounded. A number of other people from the Gurdwara were badly wounded. And I just, first of all, I was just gutted. And I remember thinking about what it would be like to have one of my loved ones killed like this. And it was a really difficult night. But I also had a feeling that this was like fate unfolding, that this was a day that was going to change my life for the rest of my life going forward. And it certainly was.
I know it's so interesting to hear you talk about how personally that hit you so early on, right, in the moment. And this was, if I'm doing the math correctly here, like almost 2 decades after you were no longer connected with that movement, but you knew it, right? You were familiar with it. And Pardeep, this wasn't just a community for you. This was intensely personal for you.
Yeah, no, it was intensely personal. But there was also this ability to kind of, even in real time, understand our responsibility, understand the community's responsibility. For us, it was this, we had about 300, 400 people that belonged to our community at the time. All of them congregated at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. My father, my mother were always there early. And the type is like, whether you're church, synagogue, masjid, gurdwara, there's just a type.
I'm not that one.
Yeah.
I'm not that one that gets to church early,
No?
but I know who they are.
Okay.
Yes.
You know those? Yeah. So they were the type to get there early. They were there 4 or 5 days a week. My dad was just really an important part of creating this intentional community in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, for people to kind of, leave their homeland, to come there, to just and Sikhi to us is very, very, it's very, very important, not only just in our lives, in our marriages, and the way we live in our existence. It's core to our spirituality. Mm-hmm. So and I think it is important to say the shooter's name. I can say it now. Wade Michael Page, when he attacked the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, he not only attacked a place, but he attacked a faith that we have in ourselves and in America, and a sanctuary that we all feel like we should have access to. My father was one of the people who was killed. He was the temple president. So I think in that light, I knew that I had a responsibility of responding to this. And over the years, it's been really this, how do how are we not defined by what happens to us, but how do we reclaim a sense of sanctuary? And that's a deeply, as you said, a communal journey, but it's also a very personal journey.
Talking about so what about, do you think that if the Sikhs and the community from your members had power in terms of political power, had a vast majority in it, things would have been changed or in any terms different? For an example, if it was a church, not a Gurudwara Sikh temple.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question that I think if we honestly wrestled with, would there be a different level of priority? Would there be a different level of sort of response? Would the law enforcement response be different if it was a church versus sometimes when we say, this is kind of a foreign community? Because as soon as we say something like that, we kind of say that, this community is a little bit
other.
Yeah, it's the
not
other.
Us, right?
It's not us, or it's something unfamiliar to us. And when something is unfamiliar to us, right, we know that over time there's been violence committed, sometimes against communities that we deem unfamiliar, whether it's mistaken, whether it's intentional. For us, we thought it was very important to not only use that time to say what we needed to say and really address the narrative of the other, but really help other people heal. Sikhi, the foundation of it is we are one. And now here was this person who came in that was trying to divide, that was trying to say, listen, you're less than, I look at you inferior, and people will not care, and maybe people will even follow him when he did something like this. And so it was important for us, and I think this is when we get into media and media literacy, is that it is important to center the voices of the healers. We don't do that enough, and some of that becomes why we are in the why we're in the dysfunction that exists today. Is that sometimes the healers may have the 8 followers, the 10 followers, the 12 followers, and the people that are dividing, or the energy that's trying to divide, has all of these people saying, there's so much dysfunction out there. But what we found was, right in the aftermath of it, there were so many people who came together, not just Arno and I, but people who didn't know who Sikhs were. In real time, when the shooting happened, it started at 10 o'clock that morning, right? 10-ish. By 11 o'clock, people made the decision, and this was Sunday, and Sundays is really important in Wisconsin. People go to church, people go to other worship services, but people made a conscious choice to say, I'm not going home today. I'm going to go show up to this place where all of these people who are deemed as strange or foreign, people didn't really know who Sikhs were. There's still a lack of education on who Sikhs are. So for people to go and say, after church, I'm going to go to this place, and all of these people are maybe I don't speak the same language, the same culture. I don't know all, but I'm going to go there. There was hundreds of people who showed up. A few hours later, there was 1,000 people outside of the Sikh temple, and somehow, some way, people were just called through empathy, through just sheer empathy.
And there's a shared level of humanity, right? Yeah. It's like, I don't know who they are. Maybe I can't even spell it. Like, I don't understand, what's important to them or what their beliefs are, but that this is a horrific thing. And as an individual, as a mother, as a family member, as a community member, I can identify with that.
Yes,
right?
It involves in a society. It is formed in a society. So I guess it is a form of level of humanity, as Tracy mentioned. Talking to Arno, now what's happening in the country, the white supremacy levels, or what do you think has enabled this white supremacy around, and how do you think we can combat it through the experiences of yours?
And also, can you address in answering that, there are all these terms that get thrown out there, right? White nationalists, white supremacy, Christian white nationalists. I was reading an article about that today that we're actually going to be publishing soon. And so, I think for a lot of people, they just all get kind of thrown in a bad pile, right? And maybe it's not clear to everybody that they're not
the differences
really
between the terms. Yeah.
one of the most influential things I've read in my life is George Orwell's essay on nationalism. It's about 2,500, 3,500 words. And he really makes the point that nationalism isn't necessarily about geographic borders on a map. That the nation in the word nationalism can be an idea. It can be a political ideology. It can certainly be the amount of melanin you do or don't have in your skin. Mm-hmm. But it can really, you can be a nationalist about anything. And therefore there's nationalists of every stripe. And it's not always just about what country you're from. As a white nationalist, I didn't call myself a white supremacist at that time. My reasoning at that point was I didn't want to be supreme over other people. I wanted to be by myself. I wanted my race to be separate from everyone else. So terms like white separatist were used within the movement, and white nationalist wasn't really as popular then as it is now. But it's semantics. In some ways, like, it is important to understand the difference. Nowadays, when I think of white supremacy, I think of the broader lie of race and how it was kind of unleashed on society 400 years ago to keep people who were on the lower financial echelons of society from banding together. The original lie of race was meant to convince poor white people that they had more in common with the rich white plantation owners than they did with enslaved Africans. Even though the poor white people were certainly better off than enslaved Africans, they were still closer to them in social status and in wealth than they were to these elite plantation owners. It's also important to understand that pre-Civil War, only like 8% of whites in the South owned slaves. So there was the majority of white people then were not slave owners.
Not the bosses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the lie of race told them that they were the same. Fast forward to today, 2025, the lie of race is still very prominent in our society. Our society is organized by this completely baseless idea that we're going to group people by the color of their skin. And as far as the lie of whiteness goes, the lie of white race is, it tells me that I have more in common with Jeff Bezos than I do with my Afro-American neighbor, simply because Jeff and I have a similar complexion and my neighbor's complexion is different than mine. When you look at it in those terms, it's plainly pretty ridiculous. But nonetheless, our society still operates according to these lies. I believe one of the prime reasons for the prevalence and kind of vigorous status of white nationalism in our society nowadays is that racial identity has become a default. When I was active as a white nationalist in the late 80s, most people racialized as white would not identify themselves that way. So if I'm going to recruit some white kid, I have an archetype called Joe Pissed Off White Kid. And that's who I wanted to recruit. If I'm talking to Joe Pissed Off White Kid, I got to do two things to make him into a white nationalist. For one, which is a prerequisite, you can't move on to two without it, I have to get Joe to identify as white. And believe it or not, in the late 80s, if I said, Joe, who are you? He would say, I'm Joe Murphy. I'm American. My family's Irish. We're Catholic. My dad's in a union. We're Democrats. He's going to have a long list of ways to identify himself rather than saying, I'm a white man. And I have to tear that all down from him. I have to convince him. I would say, Joe, the enemies of our people will identify you by the color of your skin. You don't have a choice in this matter. And once they identify you by the color of your skin, they're going to blame you for everything wrong with this world. So step two in creating a white nationalist, after someone has assumed a white racial identity, step two is to make that person feel persecuted because of it. We would say things like, why is there black entertainment television, but there's no white entertainment television? Well, the answer to that is that television from the get-go has been white entertainment television. And thus the necessity for Afro-Americans to have their own voice on TV and BET and other venues like that. But without having that historical bearing, and if you have the myopia of not understanding the history of this country, it can seem unfair. Why is there a black student union? We can't have a white student union. That's wrong. I feel persecuted. Those dynamics were very much in place in the 80s, but that racial identity was not a default. Nowadays, it is a default. And it's often people are branded with racial identities by very well-meaning people who are consider themselves to be anti-racists. They want to tear down white supremacy. In my opinion, though, the more prevalent racial identity is in society, regardless of how the dynamic is, the more prevalent racial identity is, the more fertile ground it is for white nationalism. Because there's always going to be that, why can't we do this when they all do it? If they're all banding together by the color of their skin, of course we're going to do that also.
This is so interesting. As I'm hearing you and learning, I'm thinking about the book that I'm sure you've heard of, Caste, and you know the
Isabel Wilkerson.
Right, exactly. Northwestern grad like me. I just had to throw that in. But I think it's so interesting that we look at race the way we do here in the United States, whereas in some other parts of the world, there are other things. You know, you talked about poor white people and poor black people having a lot more in common than, say, the example you gave, you and Jeff Bezos. It reminds me of the Poor People's Campaign and some of their messaging, even back to the 60s.
Absolutely.
About that. I have to ask, and I know this is probably something you want to ask too, so feel free to follow up on it. But I'm sure people ask you this all the time. How in the world did you guys end up sitting next to each other at this time? How did this happen? How did this friendship happen? Were you one of those 1,000 people that showed up at the temple? How'd you guys get together?
That's a great question. We still ponder it now, and we're still wondering, how did we get here? How did we
You
get to
don't remember?
Gettysburg? No, I remember, but it's ever evolving, right? It is ever evolving, and I think sometimes really great friendships are that way. Is that we don't always agree, we don't always disagree. We always listen to each other and consider each other's as experts of their own life. So it isn't that Arno saying, Pardeep, you should believe like this, or I'm not saying, hey, Arno, we might influence each other, sure. Right? But we influence each other, challenge each other, and can make each other better. But at that time, when the shooting happened, again, thinking back to 13 years ago, this was one of the deadliest shootings that was committed by an affiliated white supremacist in nearly 50 years, since 4 little girls endured the impact of a bomb intended for Dr. King. And I say that to bring this in the context of when we think about us as a society and as a country evolving, there's so much work that needs to be done. Baldwin talked about this in stages, and we may be on the 6th stage right now that we're looking at and saying, how do we take on these great conversations that you all bring up? How do we get past our visual perceptions of race and color and dynamic and all of these things, right? How do we not only challenge policy, but challenge psyches that say, oh, you're worth this because you're a black woman. I'm worth this because I'm an Indian man. All of us have it. All of us are conditioned into it. And now how do we unlearn it? And when that happened that day, there was a part of us that understood the spirit of all of that. To say, here's a person who has ingested this white supremacist, whatever you want to call it, dominance and power. And with a gun in hand, having a history in this culture and being ex-military, he decides that all of the grievances that he's feeling about his own personal life are blamed on this people, on the Sikh people, on that temple. And so he's going to attack them in their most vulnerable place, sanctuary, and tell the world how strong he is. Well, how do we redefine strength? How do we redefine power? And what we leaned into was our faith says we are one. When people are trying to divide us, we still hold on to all of us, and this is all of our faiths, that God made us all beautifully different. Why? Because in this lifetime, God wants us to achieve and to get to a place where we're like, I see past all the identities Arno's talking about, right? I see past race. Not that it's not important, but I see past race because I have faith. And that's what our faith was based on. And now, are we going to go against our faith and say, oh, now we see all white people as bad? Now we see all like white men as tattooed men. And that would be a hypocrisy to our faith. And so when this all sort of happened, we didn't know we were going to be here 13 years later talking to you, Tracy, and be like, hey, let's have this conversation at Gettysburg. We didn't know that. But what we did know was that we want to follow our faith. We don't want our faith to be sabotaged by fear or trauma or whatever it is. Because then at that point, it ceases to be faith. It's faith based on fear. And you know, and it was, we were both kind of doing like work. And I heard Arno's name and I was like, he's, you know, I saw him doing what he was doing and I saw the face of courage, of accepting who he was, understanding who he was. And I think when Arno was in this, there's a part of him that wanted to just you know, I was that before, I'm not that anymore, and just forget about his past without really doing the work of saying, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Whatever that I'm sorry looks like. But this became, I can't escape my past. I somehow, some way have to be accountable for that.
So you were out there doing this work and then you heard or saw him and you reached out?
I saw him, I heard him, I reached out to him. And we were both kind of working, again, we were both working for some, for this sort of online think tank around extremism. Mm. And so you can tell how do we meet?
Well, just to give a timeline, I left hate groups in 1994. Mm-hmm. I went on another 7-year like rave bender, the whole polar opposite counterculture, which was really a formative time for me. Quit drinking in 2004. That was another big milestone for me. Started writing in 2007 in an attempt to reconcile my past. I went public with my story on the MLK holiday of 2010, inspired by Dr. King's speech, A Time to Break the Silence, which is really about the Vietnam War, but the name of the speech.
I can imagine that was cathartic, but that must have also been sort of scary.
It was scary in a way. It's important to understand, like, my personality type. It would be much more difficult for me to not say anything than it is to just dump it all out. So I've always been a very open book, and I feel more comfortable that way. And once I did start telling my story, it started getting some traction. People wanted to hear it. I had a bit of a platform as like, oh, that's the former white nationalist guy. And that's what I was doing when August 5th, 2012 rolled around. I had been living this life for 1.5 years at that point, 2.5 years, sorry. So it was immediately after the shooting, I was doing media for like 8 to 10 hours a day for 3-4 days straight. And it was incredibly difficult in a lot of ways. In other ways, it was cathartic. I was grateful that people were looking to me for some kind of response because I wanted to serve. I didn't know how I was going to help the Sikh community or anyone else who was targeted by hate, but I just wanted to offer myself in whatever capacity I could to be there. And every time I was doing media, it was always just talking about compassion. Like, this compassion is one of the most beautiful aspects of our human existence. And I think everyone is worthy of it, and everyone is capable of showing compassion. We just convince ourselves otherwise sometimes for one reason or another. But I was convinced at the time, as I am now, that compassion was absent in Wade Page's life. And that was a big factor in him reaching such misery that nothing but homicide followed by suicide seemed to make sense.
When Wade Page, and in our situation, when Wade Page took the lives of 7 people, he took his own life. And so there wasn't this sort of closure There wasn't an investigation. There wasn't a prosecution, and there definitely wasn't somebody that was going to say, "Hey, listen, I'm sorry." Whatever it was, and now that I think about it, as we met, that sort of longing for, but again, we know that we don't need accountability from another community to find our worth as well. But I think that would be known to me differently if, let's say, we didn't go down the process of becoming friends. And so reaching out, this was 2 months after the shooting happened. And so reaching out to Arno and really asking him, we met in person eventually. And the question I posed to him was like, why did this person do this? The same questions we have. Why did this person choose us? And I think a succinct answer that Arno provided was,
it was practice. Really, I think I'm a Buddhist, and in Buddhism, everything's just about practices. When your typical human being thinks of practice, you think of practicing the piano or a sport or an art or what have you. And that's certainly first and foremost what practice is about. But I think all too often we find ourselves practicing things that we don't necessarily mean to practice. I always use the example of someone has a 30-minute commute to work, and every morning they listen to a radio station that has people like going, rah, 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 everything wrong is this person's fault, and everything wrong is that group's fault, and they're very angry. Well, if you listen to this every day on the way to work, you're practicing anger. Because you wouldn't be listening to this if you didn't agree with it, and you're like, yeah, you get angry too. Ah, I'm angry. Neuroplasticity is a really fascinating truth of how the human mind works. Our neurons, our brain cells are shaped kind of like spark plugs. They got like a little closed end and they have two open ends. The more often a neuron is used, those open ends grow closer together so they can fire easier. So if we're angry every day, our anger neurons get like this. So we get angry at the drop of a pin, we're angry. If we're not kind to people every day, if we don't have love in our lives, if we don't have compassion for people, our neurons for compassion, love, and kindness start to atrophy. And the distance between those two sparks basically starts to grow wider, and it takes more energy in order for that same reaction to happen. What that means is that when you're a white nationalist, and I need to make this very clear, and this is a big part of every story I tell, every message I have. When you're a white nationalist, you are terrified of every other human being on this planet. Not only ones who don't look like you, but ones who don't think like you. When you're a white nationalist, everyone who doesn't look like you is an enemy by default. Mm-hmm. And everyone who does look like you but doesn't think like you, which is the vast majority, are also enemies. They're seen as the highest order of enemies. Mm-hmm. Just to finish the practice idea, you're practicing hate and violence every day, all day, every day, and that becomes your default state of being. Pardeep always uses this imagery, which I love. If you're sitting in a car with the engine on, but you're in park still, the engine's idling, like where do you idle in your life? Do you idle at angry? Do you idle at just lazy? Idle at happy? Where do you idle? If you're a white nationalist and you practice hate and violence, you idle at hate and violence. And things like love and compassion and kindness and gratitude are not only foreign to you, they're scary to you. And that's how, after practicing hate and violence for 12 years, 14 years actually, because Wade Michael Page was radicalized in 1988 while serving in the U.S. military. So 14 years later, he was so miserable that nothing but homicide followed by suicide seemed to make sense.
Along with those lines, after that incident and after you started initiating the conversations about this extremism, how do you do that without targeting anyone? It's really difficult, as you mentioned as well, the practice.
Right.
And it's very difficult to do that. So how do you talk about extremism and combat and hate and violence and all of that without targeting anyone in particular?
It's a great question. And Arno and I, once we started sharing our stories, we spoke at a few schools, a few high schools, Certain kids were having difficulties around suicide, mental health, bullying, all kinds of issues. I don't think when we first initially had the conversation that we knew that it was going to touch so many young folks. And as we were speaking, we would have a handful of young folks or parents of young folks who were struggling with, they didn't know what to say at that time because a lot of the field of extremism wasn't exactly formed in America. We kind of knew it because we worked for this think tank in the UK, and we're like, oh, we know the signs of this. We know what this young man, and typically it is a young man, that is going through it, that is understanding his grievances and saying, I'm going to blame it on everybody else except, and so we knew what this looked like, and we would have parents who would bring their young ones to some of these conversations, and they would quite frankly just ask us, say, hey, Arno, Pardeep, we would typically have a group of about 20, 30 young folks after a talk who would come around and kind of like talk with us and want to ask questions about life and things like that, relationships, navigating life. But sometimes intentionally people would bring their sons and say, my son is getting involved in this group. My son believes in this type of ideology. Here's what's happening. And so informally, we were working with some of these young folks who really, one of the other things that we talked about the first time we discussed kind of what happened at the Sikh temple was how hurt people and how hurt, right? How much pain they were carrying, and how can we as a society be much better at not only being aware of it, but being able to address it. We have become a very judgmental kind of society over time, right? And sometimes another person's pain rubs us the wrong way, right? And so all of these things that this young man would identify as a way to protect themselves, right? We call it building a protective armor, right? Wielding a shield, right? And a sword, right? The sword attacks, the shield guards the heart that feels vulnerable, right? Right? The armor does all that, and the shield is their ideology. So these young men who were hurting were coming to some of these conversations, and here we are being extremely vulnerable, talking about the way that, I hurt or Arno hurts, and here they are seeing, wait, you can use vulnerability to address your pain. You can show that you're hurting. You don't have to mask it with pride. You don't have to mask it with what we confuse as power. And they were starting to see that, and so we would have these conversations with them that would follow up on this. And there was a lot of great success stories. Today, Arno works for an organization that helps a lot of these young men, what we call off-ramp from hate. And a lot of times you treat hate as an addiction.
That's amazing. And I find this whole conversation just so enlightening. And I can't wait to unpack more stuff with you guys. There are pieces of it that as a Black woman growing up in America, of both of your stories, that I can very much identify with. And I think that's a common theme here is that there's just, we say this all the time, but here's a perfect example of it. There's just more common ground out there than that. And I know we have to wrap up.
We do have to wrap up, but
thoughts.
Before just wrapping this up, after decades of work, what is the hope that you have that gives these meaningful conversations a change in itself?
The hope I have is kind of another answer to your question earlier about how do we address extremism without making people feel attacked. First of all, is as Pardeep pointed out, is seeing hate as an addiction and treating it as something that people need treatment for, need recovery. There's examples of how this paradigm has shifted in the past in our society over and over again. I'm an alcoholic on top of being a former hate addict, so I'm familiar with addiction from both of those perspectives. 100 years ago, if you were an alcoholic, you were just a worthless drunk. They'd throw you in jail when you're drunk in the street, and if you'd fall into a gutter and die, nobody cares. You're just a worthless drunk. That's what drunks do. We've since come, thank God, to understand that alcoholism is a disease. It can be treated, And when it's treated, people can recover from it and begin a recovery process. My hope is that we have that same process with hate addiction. And we see it from a public health perspective, which is what answers your question. That's how we do it without making anyone feel attacked. Because when we see extremism as an addiction and as a public health issue, the same way alcoholism is, we understand that hate addiction is something that every demographic is susceptible to. There's no complexion that makes you immune from being addicted to hate. There's no religion that makes you immune from it. It affects everybody from every demographic that you can possibly delineate. And when we depoliticize it and stop like the political pot shot taking from right and left about what extremism is or who it's particular to, and we see it as a public health issue, that's how we're able to best address it. And that is my hope, is that we change the paradigm on hate addiction and extremism the same way we changed the paradigm on alcoholism, same way we changed the paradigm on AIDS, HIV. When that first came out, it was highly, highly stigmatized. People were, anyone who had it thought they deserved it. Kids were even stigmatized. Nowadays, we rightfully understand as a society it's a public health issue. It has to be depoliticized and addressed as such. That's my hope, is that we do the same with extremism.
Wow. Pardeep, I think you get the last word on hope.
No, thank you, Tracy. I just hope to me rests in everyone that we touch. After that shooting happened, I think it helped our community be much more welcoming, more open, more true to our faith. And that, I don't know that necessarily needs to happen. I don't know if people need to really go through something difficult, challenging, or tragic to say, now I can live my faith. What I've seen is that a lot of people do. So the hope is that, in this lifetime, you will be going through something very difficult or painful or even tragic. But instead of becoming more, obviously bitter, we can all become better together. And that happens when we have a more compassionate society. And while we may feel like that's compassion that I express towards the world, it's actually a gift that you give yourself. Mm-hmm. So, this is a very communal but very individual, right? Give yourselves compassion. Let's keep continuing to have conversations like this.
Yeah, I would love to.
I would love to as well.
Awesome.
Now we have very limited time, and we do have to get into other commitments as well. So before that, thank you so much for coming here. It was really great talking to both of you all, and having that clarifications on ideologies and the norms and the values and the things that you learn from press, media, all of that. It just really sums up what you all have said, and it gives more clarity to me and our audience. Thank you so much for coming. It was a really great talk.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Do you have something to add?
Thank you. No, I think you wrapped it up. I'm ending on hope. I think makes me feel good, and hopefully the audience too.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Always hope. Thank you.